Well, good morning, everyone. I do hope you can hear me. I do hope you can see me. And I do hope there are individuals there out in the ether. Fantastic for you to join me to talk about Romeo and Juliet. And to help me answer one of the great questions of our time, is Romeo stupid? Well, possibly. But before I address this question, a couple of words of introduction. For those of you who don't know, my name is Julian Lamb. I'm a professor here in the Department of English at CUHK. And I'm giving today the first of 4 mini lectures. So there'll be 3 that will be offered next week on Thursday and Friday. And each of these mini lectures will consider aspects of what we do in our department. So today I'll be talking about literary studies, I'll be talking about Shakespeare. We will have 3 lectures next week, 1 also on literary studies and 2 on applied English linguistics. And these lectures are fundamentally an attempt to give candidates who might be interested in applying to our department a sense of what learning in our department might be like. This is a very strange admissions process. It's a very strange admissions year for a whole number of different reasons. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to increase our online presence. And this is one of the ways in which we can make contact with you. Now, I'm going to be considering this question of is Romeo stupid in relation to one of his speeches in Act 2, Scene 2. In fact, possibly his most famous speech, "But soft what light through yonder window breaks." Now, it would be great if you could have the speech there in front of you, but it's by no means absolutely necessary. You can find it online at the link that I included as part of this web event. But if that's too cumbersome for you to access, then no problem. If you would like to ask me questions, then you can always post them in chat, but I can't promise that I'll have time to answer them either during my talk or at the end. You can always email me questions. I'm always happy to answer questions by email. And indeed, if you want a copy of the notes that I've compiled for this talk, I'm more than happy to make those available to you by email. So with all that behind us, off we go. It strikes me that one of the things that I want to do in this talk is to give those of you who perhaps haven't done literary analysis at school or who haven't done much literary analysis at school, to give you a sense of what literary analysis actually is. Partly because I think my email is on our website. It's julianlamb@cuhk.edu.hk, easily available on our website. What is literary analysis? Well, I think literary analysis begins by our honestly giving an account of our response to a text. How does a particular text make us feel? What impact does it have upon us? And then, as a consequence of us honestly articulating what our response to a text is, we analyze the text and we look for evidence as to why a text made us respond in the way that it did. So that, as I regard it, is the initial stage in literary analysis, analyzing and coming to terms with our own responses. But there is a very important, I think, secondary stage in literary analysis, and that is this. It's where we refine, or rather even we reform our responses. Because very often our initial responses to a text might miss something or might misunderstand something. And so the process of literary analysis for me is always responding to a text and honestly giving an account of that response, finding evidence of my response, but then subsequently questioning my own response. Why did I respond that way? Is that the right way to respond? Did I miss something? Did I misunderstand something? And to a certain extent, the talk today is going to emblematize the trajectory of literary criticism as I've just articulated it. I'm going to prompt you into a particular response to Romeo's speech. It might be a response that you already have. But then I'm going to prompt you, and I'm prompting myself as well, I'm going to prompt us to reform or perhaps refine that response in the light of subsequent considerations. So, to the speech itself, let's set the stage. In a moment, I'm going to read the speech out aloud. You're going to have to suspend a degree of disbelief. The idea that I would play Romeo is frankly ridiculous. I'm not sure if you've ever imagined a bald Romeo before, but in a moment you won't even have to imagine it. But let's set the stage first. So it is night. Romeo and Juliet have met earlier at the Capulet party. Romeo, at this moment, he wanders in to the Capulet orchards, and he sees a light coming from a room, coming from a window. And he says this: "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou her maid art far more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off. It is my lady. Oh, it is my love. Oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses. I will answer it. I am too bold. 'Tis not to me she speaks. Two of the fairest stars in all of heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars as daylight doth a lamp. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek." A very familiar speech, I think a very beautiful speech. But where do we begin in our analysis of it? I think it's always helpful when analyzing a speech like this or a piece of text like this to begin at the beginning. And so let's consider those first couple of lines. Very famous lines in English literature. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Simple question, perhaps a stupid question, but nevertheless it's a starting point. Why is Juliet the sun? I think there are a couple of practical considerations that we ought to keep in mind. Firstly, the scene is dark. It's nighttime. But there is a window, and that window is illuminated, and that window will serve in a moment to illuminate the balcony upon which Juliet will come out. Now, for practical reasons, that balcony needs to be illuminated as well, else how can Romeo see that Juliet has entered? She eventually enters just before Romeo's line, "It is my lady, oh, it is my love." She has not entered yet. Romeo has simply seen a light in the darkness. She has not entered. That's partly why Romeo, I expect, says, "Arise, fair sun." He wants Juliet to come out onto the balcony. So, a dark scene, an area which is illuminated. So, to a certain extent, it makes sense that Romeo would associate Juliet with the sun because she appears where there is some degree of illumination. Now, on the Shakespearean stage, the illuminated window or balcony would have had to have been imagined. There were very limited stage lighting effects in the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. And in some sense, what Romeo is saying here is actually Shakespeare instructing his audience, everyone, remember this is dark, and that over there, it is the east, Juliet is the sun, reminding the audience that that part is illuminated. The rest of the stage is dark. Now, of course, on a modern stage, all sorts of lighting effects are possible, including lighting effects which keep the stage principally in darkness, and a spotlight might go on that balcony area, that window area, and it's into that spotlight that Juliet will emerge. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about those modern stage effects, lighting effects, is that it intensifies or potentially intensifies something that would have been apparent on the Elizabethan stage as well. Stage, this world in darkness, that moment is illuminated. Romeo will praise, will admire Juliet. To a certain extent, illuminating Juliet in that way, and Romeo praising her objectifies Juliet in, I think, very interesting and quite profound ways. We join Romeo in admiring, in praising, and perhaps potentially in objectifying her. Anyway, whether imagined or induced, created by modern stage effects, there is a kind of a real basis to Romeo's associating Juliet with the sun. There is a real visual association between Juliet and a spot of illumination. Now, of itself, this is not especially insightful or especially interesting, but I think it does allow us to see something that Romeo is doing. Romeo is here poeticizing. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean something like he is making poetry out of a situation. He is deriving poetry out of reality. It is night. There is a light source. Juliet is at that source. Therefore, Juliet is that source. Therefore, Juliet becomes the quintessential light source, the sun. Romeo is deriving poetry, making poetry out of reality. He is taking some aspect of the world that can be seen, that can be perceived by the senses, and he is turning it by degrees of association into something that is not literally true. Juliet is the sun. Now, the point that I would like to make about this is that poetry is not, as we often think of it, is not merely the expression of feeling or the expression of emotion, nor is poetry simply the representation of reality. What I would like to suggest is that poetry is something we do to reality. Poetry is an action we perform upon reality. What sort of action is it, though, that we perform on reality? What does poetry do to reality? I would like to suggest two things that poetry might be said to do to reality. The first is this. Poetry might be said to be like makeup or cosmetics that we put upon reality. Now, one of the reasons why I use this metaphor is that Shakespeare himself uses this metaphor at various times in his corpus. So, for instance, his love sonnets addressed to a beloved, he often thinks of as painting the beloved, as putting makeup on the beloved. These love sonnets, which give praise to the beloved, are a way of making the beloved look better than they actually are. Poetry, in this sense, is a form of cosmetic, a form of making reality look better, or perhaps look more noble, look more beautiful than it actually is. If that is the case, however, is there not something artificial about poetry? Is there not something about poetry which constructs a delusional reality, an artificial reality? And is that what Romeo is doing here? Is he sort of smearing foundation and lipstick and eyeshadow, as it were, all over reality? And in so doing, is he creating a kind of a fake world? Does poetry create a delusional world? And is poetry itself a kind of delusion? So that's one way in which we might say that poetry does something to reality. It distorts reality. Another way is to say that poetry reveals a truth about reality, or reveals truths about reality that we might not otherwise be aware of. Poetry acts to reveal, perhaps, what is truly significant about reality by asking us, by prompting us to perceive beneath the visual surface of reality. Does poetry uncover profundity? Does poetry uncover a significance that we might not otherwise be able to see? Here we have two very different versions of what poetry might do to reality. Poetry either is a delusion, or poetry gives us access to an underlying truth about reality. Now, why do I offer these two alternatives? Well, one of the reasons is that these two alternatives about what poetry does to the world have been so influential in Western thinking about the nature of poetry and the nature of poetic language. Does literature, does poetry create a fake world? Or does it give us access to the true world? Shakespeare was aware, intimately aware, that poetry can do both. And it's one of the really fascinating and exciting things about his text. He is aware that poetry can both delude, and it can also give us access to hidden truth. I think having this distinction in mind might also help us to come to terms with this question: is Romeo stupid? If all Romeo is doing is, as it were, smearing makeup on the world, creating for himself a kind of illusory, even if beautiful world, I think we're going to be inclined to think he's a bit dumb, he's a bit stupid, and we're certainly not going to buy into the world that he's creating. But I think we would be reluctant to regard Romeo as stupid if we found in his speech something that might be true, something that might be profound. If we found in his speech, in other words, something that resonates with our reality and not just his. Let me go back to Juliet is the sun. Of course, there are other reasons than simply the practical reasons that I articulated for why Romeo describes Juliet as the sun. By virtue of this comparison, Juliet is the sun. Juliet becomes this celestial body, this celestial, heavenly entity. The fact that she is on her balcony, she is sort of up there, confirms her sense that she is something, someone to be admired, something, someone to be praised. The association between Juliet and a celestial body, a heavenly body, continues a little later on when Romeo compares her to stars, or compares more specifically her eyes. to stars. Now, the association between the beloved and these celestial, heavenly entities, these celestial bodies, was not uncommon in the love poetry of Shakespeare's time. And one of the reasons rather, that love poets affect these comparisons is by way of uh, relating just how enormous, just how intense their love is. By describing the beloved in terms of these celestial entities, it's as if their love takes on cosmic, universal proportions. It's a form of hyperbole, a form of exaggeration. But it also communicates the heavenly or perhaps even divine nature of the beloved. It's almost as if Juliet, in being compared to the sun and stars, stops being a human being and starts becoming a kind of divinity. The fact that these celestial bodies, suns and stars and so on, are, at least in the popular imagination of Shakespeare's time, are spherical, also communicates a sense of their perfection. And that's certainly something that Romeo is here trying to communicate, a sense of Juliet's divine perfection. Describing Juliet in this way is oddly, I find, disembodying. Although this speech is said in praise of Juliet and in very passionate admiration of Juliet, the speech barely contains any specific description of her. At exactly the moment that Romeo focuses on a specific aspect of her eyes, suddenly her eyes are compared to stars. What do her eyes look like? What color are they? How does she move them? There's something oddly disembodying about this description. There is something, there are a couple of consequences of this very disembodying and disembodied description of Juliet. Exactly, yes. It almost strips Juliet of her humanity. She ceases to be a normal human being and becomes stars and sun. There are a couple of consequences to this that I'd like to articulate. The first is this. Unlike a poem, drama cannot easily do without bodies. Drama is an intensely embodied art form, unlike, for instance, poetry that you simply read off a page. After having been compared to a celestial body, the sun, for the first 8 lines, Juliet eventually emerges onto the balcony. It is my lady, oh, it is my love. Now, no matter how beautiful the actress playing Juliet is, she can hardly live up to that comparison. Juliet is the sun, and then she comes out, well, she's just an ordinary human being. She might be a very beautiful ordinary human being, but she's not the sun. No human body can match Romeo's descriptions, Romeo's comparison. And to a certain extent, no actress playing Juliet can ever live up to the anticipation generated by Romeo's description. In a poem, if you are simply reading a poem off a page, the beloved is not visible. But on stage, at least in this scene, she is. Now, one of the responses that I often have when I'm imagining this performed and when I'm seeing it performed live is Romeo says that Juliet is the sun, she comes out, and my response is, no, she's not the sun, she's a human being. And then when Romeo says her eyes are like stars, my somewhat cynical reaction is to say, no, her eyes are not like stars, they're like eyes. I can see them right there. There is something about the very embodied nature of drama which undercuts Romeo's very idealized descriptions. I would suggest that this is something that occurs throughout this play. There is a very idealized language that characters like Romeo utilize. But that idealized language is undercut by a kind of brute bodily reality. And one of the consequences of that is that we are prompted to have a perhaps cynical view of Romeo and the language that he uses. If I can use modern, more contemporary expressions, Romeo looks a little OTT, a little over the top here. She's not the sun, I can see her there. She's a human being. And this might prompt us to think, isn't Romeo a bit stupid? Another consideration, when it comes to Romeo's comparing Juliet to these celestial entities, these divine heavenly bodies, is that Romeo is also ennobling his own passion. That is, in describing Juliet as the sun and stars, these divine, celestial, heavenly entities, is he not also attempting to convince us that his passions are noble, that his passions are virtuous? Or to put it another way, in describing Juliet in these highly disembodied terms, is he not trying to convince us that it's not Juliet's body that's really attracting him? Shakespeare was very well aware of the way in which poetry can be used to ennoble passions that might not be very noble at all. Romeo has only just met Juliet. There is an intense attraction, but he knows very little about her. Whilst I wouldn't go so far as to call his passion lust, I would certainly suggest that he is physically attracted to her. One of the things that this speech is trying to do is it's trying to ennoble physical attraction. And it's doing that by providing this very disembodied description of Juliet. Now, if you have been so far persuaded by what I'm saying, or if for whatever reason you so far agree with what I have said, then it's fair to say that you are cynical of Romeo and what he's saying here, and perhaps would affirm that he's a bit stupid. Now, cynicism is a very interesting thing, and I was attempting to articulate to myself just why cynicism is powerful, and to capture how cynicism behaves in the way it does. And I came up with this silly analogy, which may well be clarifying. Cynicism is a little bit like cheap air freshener. Once you spray it, it's very difficult to get back in the can. And once you spray it, it falls on everything. In a sense, once we're cynical of Romeo, it's very difficult to be uncynical of him. And it's also very difficult to remove that cynicism from almost every aspect of his character. But what I would like to suggest is this. There is good reason for why we might respond to this speech cynically. We can find all sorts of evidence for why we might respond in a cynical way. But I don't think we should be simply cynical. That initial response, I think, requires refining. It requires reforming. Cynicism is a consequence of our criticism or our critical judgment of Romeo. What I would not want to do is to remove our capacity, remove our tendency to critically judge Romeo. That's hugely important. But if all we ever do is critically judge Romeo, if all we ever do is be cynical of him, then can this play truly be a tragedy? I would suggest no. If all we do is think Romeo is stupid, then I don't think his death at the end is going to carry the weight that a tragedy requires. Romeo as a character will lack the stature, the nobility that is required of every tragic character. If all we ever think of Romeo is that he's dumb, he's stupid, he's in his own deluded world, then his death at the end will be, well, there's another stupid person who dies. So in order to see this play, rightly, I think, as a tragedy, our cynicism, our critical judgment of Romeo, which I don't think we can get rid of or should get rid of, must nevertheless be balanced against something else. What must it be balanced against? Well, I think it must be balanced against something we might find perhaps endearing about this character. Something perhaps about this character that we can identify with. Our criticism, in short, of Romeo must be balanced against empathy. Criticism, identification. These are the two crucial ingredients to tragedy. And it's in this strange combination of both our capacity to criticize a character and our capacity to identify with a character that the magic of tragedy is produced. So what about Romeo can we identify with? Let me gesture to something that I haven't mentioned yet. Romeo's poeticizing, his making poetry out of reality, is an act of play. And it is done in and with a spirit of great energetic playfulness. One of the things that I get out of this speech, and that I'm not really able to convey in my reading of the speech because I'm not as good a performer, is that there is such joyful energy in this speech. It's energy and joy that I happen to find oddly endearing. Perhaps we can call it a childlike energy. Perhaps we can call it a naive energy. But there is something endearing about Romeo's spirit of poetic play. He himself is not taking what he says seriously. And so if we laugh at Romeo, we must also acknowledge that he's having a lot of fun himself. Consider the playful way in which Romeo makes reference to the stars. So, he says, 2 stars. He asks us to imagine 2 stars in the night sky. 2 stars have had to leave their normal position in the night sky and go on, he says, some business somewhere. And they have asked Juliet's 2 eyes to take their place. But then Romeo reasons, if Juliet's eyes took the place of these 2 stars, why, her eyes are so bright that they would illuminate the whole sky, and night would become day. Now, this is hyperbole. This is exaggeration. And there is great poetic delight that Romeo is taking in creating this exaggeration, this hyperbole. He is playing. Romeo obviously doesn't think that that is actually happening. The poetic world he is constructing is not one that he is so deluded enough to live in himself. Rather, Romeo's playful, poetic energy, I would like to suggest, is part and parcel of an instinct to find words that can justly register an overwhelming experience. And that overwhelming experience for Romeo is having met Juliet for the first time. Sees her, meets her, and the experience is so overwhelming that he is brought into these almost spasms of poetry. I need to poeticize. And he is full of this energy, and it's a joyful energy. And to a certain extent, I find that very endearing. But there is something yet more profound, I think, about what Romeo is doing here. I would suggest that the impulse that Romeo is acting upon is not an uncommon impulse. It is an impulse, perhaps it's even a basic human impulse, to find words that can justly bear witness to an experience which is overwhelming, to an experience which for us is profound, or an experience which is of enormous significance to us. It's at this point, and I'm concluding now, it's at this point that I would like to offer you a definition of poetry, certainly not the be-all and end-all of definitions of poetry, one among many, many definitions of poetry, but one that might well clarify what is going on at this moment, and one that might well clarify what we ourselves are called upon to do at various moments in our lives. What is this definition of poetry? Poetry is a task that we ask language to perform. And the task that we ask language to perform is to function in a way that justly bears witness to things that are significant or profound or overwhelming. Or rather, the function that we ask language to perform is to make us, to allow us to justly bear witness to things that are overwhelming or profound or is significant to us. And I would suggest this is something that we are quite frequently called upon to do in our lives. And I was thinking of some of the various ways in which we are called upon to do this. Let me offer you 3 ways, 3 quite silly ways, but nevertheless, maybe clarifying. Let's say I went on a holiday overseas, perhaps to the Grand Canyon. I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but I hear it's an overwhelming experience when you stand on that platform and you look out and you return from your holiday back to Hong Kong and someone asks you, so what was the Grand Canyon like? At that moment, you are called upon to relate an experience which for you was almost overwhelming, profound, significant. And when we are called upon to do that, I would argue we are standing on the very threshold of poetry. We are called upon to use language which can bear witness, that can allow us to bear witness to the profound. There are moments in our lives when we are called upon perhaps to express our admiration for a particular person or a particular text. And at those moments too, we are called upon to articulate our almost overwhelming feelings about a particular person or a particular text. And finally, there are moments in our lives when we are asked to give an account of what's important to us, what's profound to you, what do you value in life, what is significant to you. And at those moments when we're asked to do that, I would argue we're on the very threshold of poetic language. We need to ask of language. I need to articulate something that bears witness to the profound and the overwhelming. And I would argue that that's exactly what Romeo is doing here, and that it isn't unusual. He is asking language to bear witness to something that is of enormous profundity to him. And Shakespeare, for his part, is reminding us that when language performs this function of bearing witness to the profound, it has the capacity both to reveal a truth about the world and indeed also to construct an illusion about the world. In studying Shakespeare, and I think in studying language and literature, we acquire the skills to distinguish between those two things. And I'll conclude by saying, I think that's a very important skill for us to learn. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone. As I said, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to email me, julianlam@cuhk.edu.hk, and I promise to respond promptly. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.